close to 50% of Canadians are actually now having a negative perspective of Islam and Muslim in general. Are you still optimistic that things could go in a positive direction?
Well, I have hope. I also don't want to sugarcoat things. So certainly, as I mentioned earlier, Islamophobia is of great concern in Canada. You know, Canada is sadly the top G7 country with the highest number of deadly attacks on Muslims. That's frightening stuff. We know that hate crimes, police reported hate crimes, which is only a tip of the iceberg, has shown an increase of 72% of hate crimes targeting Muslims between 2020 and 2021. You know, if we look at various studies that show over a 25-year period, for example, in the New York Times, Muslims and Islam were mentioned more negatively than cocaine, than cancer. This is a study that showed that. You had other studies that showed 84% of media representation of Muslims who were involved in some kind of potential, terrorist activity, but they hadn't actually, gone through with anything. That was 84% of the coverage, yet they were only actually 6% of those involved in those types of incidents.
If you had the ability to speak to an Islamophobe right now, face to face, like someone who really dislikes Muslims, what would you tell them?
Oh, that's a good question.
Hello everyone, welcome to my podcast and thank you for tuning in. It feels incredible to be back, especially after a brief pause from posting new content. As you may already know, the core mission of this podcast is to create a platform for insightful conversation that challenges stereotypes and empower the Muslim community to reclaim its narrative. In this episode, I had the privilege of sitting down with the remarkable and inspiring Amira Elghawaby, a true trailblazer who now serves as the newly appointed special representative in combating Islamophobia in Canada. Amira has not only been a mentor, but a significant source of inspiration for me. Her influence in my professional trajectory and passion for creative content production cannot be overstated. In fact, I dare to say that this very podcast that you're listening to right now might have not existed without the profound impact that Amira had on me. During our conversation, we touched base on many topics such as identity, Amira's remarkable career path, and the pressing issue of Islamophobia in Canada. As we delve into these crucial topics, we explore the power of creative content production as a potent tool to combat misconception and build bridges of understanding. Throughout the discussion, Amira generously shares her vast knowledge and experience in shedding light on the path forward. Together, we explore how Muslims can leverage creative expression to break down barriers, foster empathy, and promote a deeper understanding of Islam. Join us in this transformative conversation to learn more about Amira's wisdom in navigating the complex scene of combating Islamophobia and building an inclusive society. Without further ado, I hope you enjoy the show.
Amira, Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for coming to the podcasts. What a pleasure.
Alaikum salam. Thanks so much, Eduardo, for inviting me.
I mean, it's almost like a dream come true. You coming here, talking to me about so many things I want to talk about. I mean, I feel like I'm dreaming.
Well, it definitely feels like a full circle moment, subhanAllah, right? Where we, I think when we started to get to know each other, it was many years ago. And it was through storytelling, actually, through work that I was doing at the time at the National Council of Canadian Muslims. Is about how do Muslims reclaim their narratives? How do we tell our own stories? So here we are, probably 5-6 years later, and you're doing just what I was hoping young Muslims, energetic Canadian Muslims would do. And that is, look for ways to tell our stories. So, congratulations to you, Eduardo, mashallah, for getting to this point where here we are in a professional podcast studio having this conversation.
I appreciate that. And I think I have a huge debt of gratitude for everything you've done, especially for me, because truth be told, I completely changed my trajectory thanks to the work you were doing at the time when you were the communication director for NCCM. That workshop, I think it was called The Media, Islam and You.
That's right.
Really caused that paradigm shift, whereas I started to think of media as something positive. Before that workshop, I really thought the media was the devil, because you see it oftentimes being used such in a negative way towards your own tribe or people who that you start building that distrust. And I remember that workshop that you had conducted, you started off by asking everyone in the room, what's the first word that comes to your mind when you hear the word media? And everyone unanimously said something bad. And I never forgot that moment where you said, isn't it interesting? Because if you look at media in of itself, its intended purpose is good, to inform people, make power accountable, right? To give a voice to people. And I was like, hold on a second. Wow, I'm just having like a light bulb moment. Mm-hmm. And then I remember Malcolm X's quote, when I'm paraphrasing here, he said that the media is the most powerful tool in the world because it has the potential to make the villain look into the victims and the victims into the villain. And then you invited over professionals for all over the country who were just sharing their skills. And I was just really inspired. And from there, I bought my first camera. I started to like just play around with it. And one thing led to the other. And then I started to do full-time filmmaking. And that opened up an opportunity to work at a charity as a marketing director. And it just completely changed my career path.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. Well, and I also, I want to really give a shout out to the Inspirit Foundation, because the Inspirit Foundation is a nonprofit organization that, is continuously committed to promoting pluralism in this country and advancing the type of storytelling that allows us to humanize different communities, including Muslim communities, Indigenous communities, etc. And so they actually, knew what I was hoping to do, coming from a media background, coming from seeing how Muslim communities for far too long had been talked about, not talked with, not talked for themselves as much as we needed to see, particularly after 9/11. And so, came up with this idea of this workshop, inviting Canadian Muslims who are already doing films, as you said, writing stories. Zarka Nawaz, we had a filmmaker, Nilüfer from Snow Angel Films came to do some work. We had a range, of Quebec film artists here, and again, writers, etc., coming and sharing those stories. And so the Spirit Foundation saw the value of that. And, I've shared since then, how that's impacted on people. And so, that's it. It just takes an idea and the right support from allies as well as those in our own communities to help do this type of change, make change.
So in your opinion, why do you think that we as Muslims sometimes, and correct me if you don't share that perspective, but I feel, and it's purely anecdotal, we have this unease with media beyond the fact that it's sometimes used in a negative way when it comes to sharing our story. I feel like sometimes we as Muslims do to the media what we don't want people to do to us as Muslims, which means not be able to differentiate the means and the person driving the means. You know what I mean? Because objectively speaking, the media is a force of good, but we still feel uncomfortable with it. Like, try to go with a camera inside of a mosque. Good luck. People are going to be like, what are you doing here? Like there's this unease around it. And I'm just really curious to know, what is it that we can do collectively on an individual level, institutional level, to have that paradigm shift? Because I had that moment, in that workshop. And I think it would be so much beneficial for us as a community to start honing in the power of, creative content production and quality media production.
Yeah, I think that there is an understandable unease, and it goes back decades. As far back as you want to go, we have seen Muslims portrayed in negative ways. Edward Said talked about this in various books that he's written. You look at even before 9/11, one of my media professors at Carleton University, Professor Kareem H. Kareem, had written a book called The Islamic Peril, where he had actually talked about media portrayal of Muslims over several decades, and that's before 9/11. In fact, he was the first person that I booked for the morning show the week after 9/11 happened, because we knew, unfortunately, that after that horrific terrorist attack in New York in 9/11, that our communities were going to be scapegoated, that we were going to be stereotyped and viewed as, a security threat. It wasn't the beginning of that thought, but it certainly was very much amplified, as many of us remember. And so, if we look at various studies that show, over a 25-year period, for example, in the New York Times, Muslims and Islam were mentioned more negatively than cocaine, than cancer, right? This is a study that showed that. You had other studies that showed 84% of media representation of Muslims who are involved in some kind of potential, terrorist activity, but they hadn't actually, gone through with anything. That was 84% of the coverage, yet they were only actually 6% of those involved in those types of incidents as compared to other members of other communities. So the disproportionate view in the media and scrutiny on our communities that really conflated terrorism and Islam as almost becoming synonymous. And in fact, now when we look at the definition of what Islamophobia is, according to Ontario Human Rights Commission or the federal government's own anti-racism strategy, part of what Islamophobia is, along with the discrimination, the stereotypes, and the violence even that can be targeted at Muslims in Islam, is that view that Muslims are a greater security threat to the state on an institutional level, to society. That's part of what Islamophobia actually is and what we have to combat it. And the way to combat it, number one, is through education, through awareness, and again, through demonstrating through our storytelling the diversity of our communities. Obviously that, all of us are generally right here trying to contribute as positively can, raising our families. That it seems quite logical to say that we're just like everybody else. We do have our faith beliefs and we practice on different levels, just like any other faith community will. And there's lots of diversity, but this idea of a monolith, this idea that we are somehow a fifth column, all of those types of ideas have been promoted and permeated our media for a long time, and especially in the last 20 years. So understandable that Muslims in Canada and elsewhere are going to feel worried when TV cameras show up, because they often show up if there's bad news to share.
So I hear you. So now what can we do to actually change that? Because yes, there's a lot of things that were done, unfortunately, to portray us in a negative light, and I get it. There is a little bit of a traumatic experience with how media portrays Muslims. But if we're going to be serious on, making our place at the table, I think it's important for us to have the power to tell our own stories and to have that paradigm shift and understand that we're missing out on an amazing opportunity to contribute to civil society and be able to show the beauty of our faith to the world. And it's almost as if we're afraid to take our place and share what we have to share because of that inferiority complex that's being generated by that negative portrayal. Like when I converted to Islam, literally I had this epiphany, this moment where Muslims are sitting on a gold mine. It doesn't even seem like we're aware of it, and we're not sharing our values as we should have. And that was always a little bit of a frustration because, from someone who came from having such a negative perspective of what Islam is to fully falling in love with the religion and the faith. That's literally what happened to me. I was a little bit angry because in my mind I was like, that could have been avoided, all these type of intellectual shortcuts that I had towards what Islam was and who Muslims were could have been avoided if there was an alternative way for me to find out more about Islam. So I'm going a little bit on a rant here, but I'm just really curious to hear from you. What are the solutions?
Mm-hmm. I think what we've learned and what we should know as diverse Muslim communities with many intersectional identities is that many other communities until now and in the past have also faced the types of stereotypes and discrimination that we currently are experiencing. So there's an excellent book, The Myth of the Muslim Tide by Doug Saunders, where he actually wanted to understand where these Islamophobic ideas were coming from, the types that would lead, for instance, a Norwegian terrorist to go and shoot and kill young campers at a sort of a liberal kind of party camp in Norway because he believed that party was too permissive when it came to immigration, and specifically Muslim immigration, for instance. So Doug Saunders, a journalist for the Globe and Mail, said, I want to understand, where did these ideas come from? And as he was studying that, he actually found that many of the same types of stereotypes and narratives that are used now against Muslims, often by the far right, have been almost carbon copied from previous types of narratives that have existed about a variety of other minority communities that now you would never consider would be facing stereotypes. Italians, Irish. We know that anti-Semitism is still very much with us, but Jewish communities have had almost word for word the types of narratives that are now used against us, that you can't be trusted, etc. All of these communities have had to share their stories, have had to come forward with serious information, but also the lighthearted stuff. I mentioned Zarqa Nawaz earlier. She was the creator of Little Mosque on the Prairie, and more recently a CBC Gem special called Zarqa. And one of the interesting things that she had told me years ago was when she came out with that show, a lot of members of our own communities were uncomfortable because they said, "Oh, you're making fun of our communities. You're making it light. Maybe it seems useless to some people to be sharing, the debate over, whether or not to have, a divider in the mosque, for example, right? These kinds of things." But the show was so valuable because it is actually in the silly things, in maybe useless things, that we are humanizing ourselves. And so I think when we talk about how can Muslims generally, continue to confront the stereotypes that we face, that other communities face and have faced, I think it really is first not to assume that there aren't storytellers just like yourself, Eduardo, who are already pushing back. There are many examples that I could list off of journalists, of artists, of filmmakers within our communities that are doing incredible work, getting awards for them. And so I think there are those efforts. And I think what we have to understand too is that, when we know of these artists or authors, we should be supporting them. We should be buying these books. We should be watching these films. We should be contributing and making sure there's an audience. Yeah. That there's an audience for this. Sharing it through our own social media. I often said at those workshops that we can curate our own content through social media. We can amplify. We can demonstrate the voices that we want heard more frequently than others. It's not always simple like that, of course. Yeah. We know the algorithms. We learned about Facebook, for example. Angry posts are going to get more attention than perhaps the nice post about, your neighbor versus something that makes people angry. We know the algorithms aren't always on our side, but in general, I think we have to recognize that our communities have come a long way in telling our stories, and we really need to encourage that and support it however we can.
Hey, if you're new on this channel and you are enjoying this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to this channel, as this would really help me in bringing a more nuanced perspective of who Muslims are and what Islam is in the public arena. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you, Amira, how did your career take such a turn? You are now a public figure. People know about you. You have a media background. You've done a lot for the Muslim community. So I wanted you to share a little bit about your career and how did you end up where you are now? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I was born in Cairo, came when I was a baby to this country, raised in Ottawa. I've talked before, I have a TED Talk that kind of encapsulates a little bit of sort of my values in terms of how I view diversity, inclusion, pluralism in Canada, how I view myself within that mosaic, if you will. I always, and I continue, although sometimes it's hard, but I continue to hold on to a strong belief that Canada is a place where people can be fully who they are in all the richness of their identities. And the reason I hold that so strongly in my heart is, that's what I experienced as I was growing up. And whether it was in elementary school where I had a school principal who, invited me, one of like 5 Muslim students out of a school of about 150, to do a presentation about Islam when we were in the 4th grade. And, seeing that we had a different faith background, and it wasn't something negative. It was something positive that we were encouraged to share with the community, with the school community. And later in high school, being active in the Multiculturalism Club. and just celebrating diverse cultures. You know, we had in our school cafeteria, I think, 140 flags hanging from the ceiling representing all the different backgrounds in our school. I loved that. I thrived on that. I loved learning about different cultures and communities and people. And then, you know, so I just really strongly believed, and I continue to. The reason I say sometimes it's hard is because, of course, we know that Islamophobia is an issue in this country, and you know, my role now is to work with others and with the federal government to combat it. But you know, at the core, there are values in this country. I really believe that. And when I decided to wear the headscarf in university, I told my dad at the time, who was worried. He was worried and a little opposed to it. He thought it was going to, you know, put a barrier for my success professionally. And I said to him, you know, if I can't wear the headscarf in this country, where can I wear it? Mm-hmm. You know, I really believed, and again, I'm still wearing it today. That's, you know, 20 years ago. And I have had professional success, alhamdulillah. I've had setbacks though too, of course. And I have, of course, faced stereotypes. I have faced discrimination, no doubt. I have, you know, faced harassment wearing the headscarf. But by and large, I do believe that a large number of fellow Canadians really do appreciate the diversity of this country, acknowledge it, understand it, and recognize that, you know, this country, first and foremost, was, you know, belonging to Indigenous communities, Indigenous, Métis, you know, First Nations communities, and everyone else is an immigrant. And we're all here to do the same thing, which is hopefully to help prosper, a prosperous country for everyone. So those were the values that I carried with me as I moved in my life, and I went into journalism. As I said, I was at Carleton University. I wound up working at the CBC. I wrote articles for a variety of newspapers, and again, you know, my interest in racialized communities, in, you know, communities that were not, you know, that were underserved by mainstream media at the time. This is around 2001, 2002, 9/11 had happened. And, you know, it was an opportunity to be at the table, as you alluded to earlier, being at the table, you know, the first Muslim woman, you know, in a headscarf, working at this Toronto Star, working at the CBC, you know, being there, and being able to bring in different experiences from others around the table, I think, again, sort of spoke to the need for us to be there. And there was a willingness to listen. Not always, you know, not all my story ideas, for example, were always accepted like other journalists, but there was a real interest and a real willingness and a recognition that, you know, Canada is a diverse country. I think 1 in 5 people are visible minorities. And, you know, in order to fully reflect that diversity, we're going to need journalists, we're going to need producers, we're going to need people who can reflect on those stories. Now, again, we know that if you look at journalism today, and this is a bit of a segue, but, you know, in Canada, it's not, you know, the higher you go up in journalism institutions, it's not representative of our population. It's still very much non-racialized who are holding positions of power when it comes to our mainstream media. And so that, again, speaks to, you know, the need for further advocacy on encouraging not only, you know, newsrooms to ensure that they are hiring and looking for journalists from diverse communities, but that within our own communities that we encourage people to enter into these types of professions, though it may sometimes be different because people want to be engineers or doctors or lawyers, but that the arts are very important as well. So long way to say, I went into journalism. I found myself working in journalism for a few years, and then became an advocate. I joined the National Council of Canadian Muslims initially to work in human rights as a human rights officer, where we were taking in complaints from Muslims across the country. This is 2012. and starting to recognize that there was an emerging pattern of discrimination, of Islamophobia that, we had seen since 9/11, but that was continuing. It was continuing, it was affecting kids in schools, it was affecting people in their employment, and eventually became a communications director and continued in advocacy for many years after that in various spaces, in the labor movement, in anti-racist organizations, until, I applied for the position of Special Representative Combating Islamophobia and was appointed just a few months ago.
Well, congratulations on that.
Thank
You're
you.
more than qualified, and you're making us all really proud.
Thank you.
And I hope you know that we are behind you. I mean, everyone that I speak with unanimously feel really elated that you are representing us. So, mashallah, very happy about that. I wanted to ask you a personal question since, I believe a lot of the obstacles that are unfortunately sometimes put in the way of people such as yourself are put in the way because you are actually qualified, and that makes sometimes people feel intimidated. How does that make you feel?
Yeah, I think what's always very important for anyone who is determined to have an impact and make change is to really keep focused on the objectives at hand, to find one's allies, one's supporters, to work together. I've had several presentations with community members and community groups over the past few months, and I have said, clearly this is not a one-person job. Combating Islamophobia is a collective responsibility, and all of us have a role to play, Muslims and those who are not Muslim, all of us as a society. And so, whenever we have barriers in our way, especially those of us who are working anti-racist initiatives, challenging status quo, I think that it's just simply important to continue to support one another, and again, to keep our eye on the prize, which is a Canada that is inclusive of all people and that includes Muslims and allows Muslims to fully participate in society, free of discrimination, free of Islamophobia, and fully able to practice their faith or not practice their faith as they wish, like any other person in this country.
Mm-hmm. I don't have my hands on the latest statistics, but last time I checked, close to 50% of Canadians are actually now having a negative perspective of Islam and Muslim in general. Are you still optimistic that things could go in a positive direction? What is your outlook on the future?
Yeah, I think we can look at that question as a glass half empty, glass half full. Mm-hmm. So yes, there's a concerning number of people in Canada who have negative views on Islam. But as we talked about earlier, a lot of that comes from, media. A lot of it comes from just simply not knowing Muslims. Even you talked to Eduardo about, used to be an Islamophobe. Yep. And it was, I'll let you share maybe the story, but it was really about getting to know Muslims that allowed you to better appreciate and understand the faith beyond the headlines, beyond, the sensationalization of stories. So I see that, yes, there's a lot of work to do. But, again, 50% don't have a negative view. So that's good news. And another poll, I'll share another poll I just saw recently. Maple Lodge Farms actually has this incredible campaign called Sharing Halal, which actually is all about combating Islamophobia and finding allies. And they have all these beautiful videos of, a Muslim and an ally talking together and sharing why it's so important together to work for an inclusive society. And in that poll, I think it was, 47% of Canadians do see themselves as an ally. Okay, we're not at 100%, that's okay, but, it's still hope. And I think that anyone doing this type of work has to hold on to that hope.
I love your optimism. And, with regards to my personal story, I was blessed enough to meet Muslims like you who were confident about their faith and who stood firmly in what they believed and said, we're not going to back down, erase our identity just because it makes some people uncomfortable. I think that's a good segue to a question that I wanted to ask you. There's been this interesting study conducted a few years ago, whereas they had a participant in a room with actors, and they asked the participant to actually make a judgment call based off of the length of two sticks that were clearly different length. And they asked him to basically respond to this simple question: is the length of the stick the same? So the respondent clearly said, no, it's not. It's obvious that they're different. And then they had the paid actor to say that it was the same. So they were actually afterwards taking the participant in private and asking him, what's your opinion on that guy who said that they were the same? Like, aren't you second guessing yourself that they're different? And he was like, no, this guy's probably high or drunk or something. But then they did something interesting. They increased the amount of actors that said that the length of the sticks were the same. And the more people were added as actors, the higher the probability of the person actually now succumbing to that pressure and, you know, saying that the length was the same, although they were clearly not the same. And the reason why I'm bringing this study up is because I'm a little concerned as to what this normalization of Islamophobia in mainstream media is causing in terms of creating collective illusions of who Muslims are, right? And I see a lot of Muslims letting go of their identity because of the fact that when they look left, when they look right, they feel pressured to believe there's something wrong with them. And you can't really, unfortunately, I mean, I don't know how to put this into words, but I feel like I'm a confident Muslim, right? But you can't say to someone else, hey, be confident. You know, you're sitting on a gold mine, right? What is the best way that you can tell Muslims out there, hey, you know, you should be confident about who you are? And I think you're a good role model for that. I think a lot of people look up to you because you've, mashallah, achieved a lot. But practically speaking, what would you say to that person struggling with their faith and feeling like they're pressured to let go of who they are? What would you say to that person if you had the chance?
Well, first of all, I mean, I think that our faith teaches us to have hope, to always have hope. This is sometimes part of our test, you know, a test of our faith. And while I have hope, I also don't want to sugarcoat things. So certainly, as I mentioned earlier, Islamophobia is of great concern in Canada. You know, Canada is sadly the top G7 country with the highest number of deadly attacks on Muslims. We've had the Quebec City massacre. We've had the attack on the Afzal family. We've had a volunteer caretaker killed, stabbed to death in Toronto. Exactly. So, you know, that's frightening. That's frightening stuff. We know that hate crimes, police-reported hate crimes, which is only a tip of the iceberg, has shown an increase of 72% of hate crimes targeting Muslims between 2020 and 2021. We know, I was just in Edmonton and Calgary, and in Edmonton, Black Muslim women in hijab for about 8 to 9 months especially, but continuously until today, have been harassed, have been targeted, have been assaulted. So, you know, and I've been meeting with Muslims here in Montreal just the past few days and hearing from visible Muslim women who wear the hijab who are feeling that they are limited in their professional prospects because they are not welcome in all professions to visibly wear their hijab. So, and sometimes feel worried as they move in their communities. So I will always have hope, and I will encourage people to have hope and to find each other and to support each other. But we also can't sugarcoat it, and we have to address it, and we have to talk about it, and we have to bring it forward, and we have to report what's happening to us, because we have a right. We have a human right. We have human rights to be treated with dignity, with fairness. There's a Charter of Rights and Freedoms in this country. There are provincial human rights codes that guarantee that we are all treated with dignity. We have freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of association, equality rights. So I think it's very important that we know the problems, but we also understand that we have the tools in a country like Canada to advocate for those human rights in the same way that other minority communities have advocated and continue to advocate for their rights.
Very balanced and nuanced answer. I love it. One of the questions I've been wanting to ask you is, you know, in the book, one of my favorite books, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey talks about the personality ethic and the character ethic. basically, the personality ethic is once you live a life where you're so concerned about what people think that is always a starting point at which you evaluate what you should and shouldn't do. And the character ethic is more driven by, hey, this is what I believe and this is what I'm going to do, and based off of my values and my deeply held convictions. I think the answer is somewhere in the middle, but I do see a lot of us Muslims, unfortunately, sometimes being so overly obsessed as well with, how are we appearing and how are we perceived, that we lose ourselves even further. And Yasmin Mogahed says it so beautifully in her book, Reclaiming Your Heart. I'm a big fan of her. She's my favorite writer, by the way. What you focus on grows, right? And I see a lot of Muslims focusing a lot on that negative energy, negative perception, and just seeing that grow, right, in their mind, in their lives, and that exacerbates the anxiety. So obviously you can't ignore it, but you can also be obsessed with it and think about that all the time. So my question to you is, how does someone like you, who's always in the public eye and always, reading the news, staying updated with what's happening in the world, manages to not get sucked into being so obsessed, with people's perspective of you and opinion of you, because obviously a lot of them are wrong about who you are. Clearly, like when you read the news, like they're not talking about the Amira that I know, because Amira is amazing, mashallah. So how do you manage that? Because it must be really hard. And I'm really curious to ask, because I think if you're able to answer that, a lot of people could find a secret to kind of unlock potential to not be afraid to be in the public eye. Because I think that's something that's stopping a lot of people, that fear of losing oneself and to becoming so obsessed with like what people are projecting, what people are saying, and you staying grounded. No, this is who I am. This is what I believe, and this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah, I mean, Eduardo, I appreciate the kind words, and I think all of us, generally who are in advocacy, I think we understand that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And when I first started working in advocacy, we were really facing quite an uphill battle, even in having the term Islamophobia recognized. Even the idea of Canadian Muslims, that term was not very much used. And now, add to Canadian Muslims, we talk Muslims in Canada, because there are newcomer Muslims, there are refugee Muslims. Again, our communities are very diverse and intersectional. But it really felt like an uphill battle. But, just over 10 years later, a decade, I'm actually, again, inspired and hopeful that not only have we ensured that Islamophobia is understood, and sadly it has taken the death of 6 men in Quebec City and an intergenerational family in London, Ontario, and may God rest their souls, for people, including elected officials, to finally recognize that what Muslims have been talking about in this country for many decades is real. Islamophobia is real, just as any other form of racism is real. Anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Indigenous hate, all of it, right? And so I think that we just have to understand that change doesn't happen overnight. But just in the past 10 years, I think in Canada, we have seen positive steps forward. There have been setbacks, don't get me wrong. We can look in different parts of the country and you see setbacks. But that's part of the journey. And I think that we, again, need to keep our eye on the prize, which is a Canada that is inclusive of everyone. And not only to stand up for ourselves, but to stand up for other communities as well. Absolutely critical in this work.
Creating allyship and staying focused on the prize. You talk a lot about that. I love it. You're very focused, and I think it can't be stated enough, to stay focused. I want to ask you some rapid fire questions just to end the podcast, because I know you have a lot on your plate, and thank you for being generous with your time. If you had one message that you can write on a billboard that all of Canadian society would be able to read, what would you write?
Stronger together.
Beautiful. I love that. What book would you recommend to the audience to understand a little bit more what is at stake here in terms of building social cohesion, acceptance, embracing diversity, and being stronger together? Is there a book in particular?
Oh, that's a good question. There was there was a really good book that I read a few years ago by the former Governor General, Adrienne Clarkson. I think it was called Belonging. And it talks about her vision of Canada as a pluralistic country. And I did find a lot of inspiration in that book.
Okay, great. What's the biggest compliment that you have ever received? And I'll explain what a compliment is. It's someone essentially complimenting you and insulting you at the same time. I'll give you an example. Someone told me once, you watch too many motivational videos. Okay. I was like, thank you. I appreciate it. You're saying that I'm motivating, but like, yeah.
That's an interesting one. I'm not sure.
You're not sure?
I'm not sure. I try to just ignore. I just try to ignore if I'm
stay focused.
I'm getting an underhanded compliment. I'll just take the compliment part and leave the rest.
Amazing. And one of the last questions I wanted to ask you is, if you had the ability to speak to an Islamophobe right now, face to face, like someone who really dislikes Muslims, what would you tell them? And you had just two sentences you could tell them.
You're wrong.
Short and sweet.
You're absolutely wrong. Everything you think about Muslims is wrong.
Absolutely. I completely agree. Amira, it's been a very delightful experience to have you on board. Thank you for everything you're doing. I'm praying that Allah gives you strength and continues to keep you focused and energized, because I think every second, of your time is so precious. And I feel like sometimes I'm even shy to call you, because I'm like, every second of your time, you're not talking to me, you're doing something more important, So I'm really grateful that you came all the way and that you're here, to share these words of inspiration. And I hope that many people will listen, think, reflect, and do what I've done, which is, how can I convert what is being said into something meaningful and practical, because that's the objective of this podcast. And a lot of this is a result of your contribution. So your work is paying dividends and is really highly appreciated. I just want you to know that.
Well, thank you so much. And everything I do, it's really being creator-centered and just really believing in the goodness of humanity. So thank you, Eduardo. I'm really proud of the work you're doing, and just want to encourage you to keep doing it. So thanks so much for having me on your podcast.
Thank you, Amira. God bless your soul. Salam.
Alaikum salam.
Hey, if you're new on this channel and you are enjoying this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to this channel, as this would really help me in bringing a more nuanced perspective of who Muslims are and what Islam is in the public arena. Thank you.